When most people think of Philadelphia, they often think of cheesesteaks, sports teams, or maybe even Rocky. But this city's real claim to fame is something far bigger. It's where the United States of America was born. But these hallowed buildings are more than just history lessons. They are the rooms where freedom itself was imagined, debated, and made real. So today we walk the streets where it all came together, from soaring ideals to fragile compromise, and rediscover how one city laid the foundation for a country still striving to meet its promise. In previous videos, we visited Boston and New York, the spark and the cradle that bookended the revolution. But today, we're standing in the city where it all came together. The layout, we have the old City Hall, which was used by the U.S. Supreme Court. Independence Hall, which was built as the Pennsylvania State House. And then Congress Hall, which was built as the county courthouse here at Philadelphia County. Some time frames, timelines. And here we are. Independence Hall. Congress Hall on this end. And the old City Hall right down there. The only way to get inside is with a timed tour, I believe. We do have one of those, so we'll check that out. I really appreciated our ranger tour guide of Independence Hall. You get to go inside, and they tell you about the history of the building that's used for colonial government, including all aspects of colonial British government that was here. Executive, legislative, and judicial. And then using the building for the Second Continental Congress and kicking all of the British the government agents
is the
to the upstairs, to the executive aspect,
the signing
to the
of the
executive
Declaration
floor.
of
Welcome to the Assembly Room. Number one, we have things that look old, but they are not old because they are fake. Number two, we have things that look old and are old, but we got them at an antique market. Finally, we have things that look old and are old, and they are actually from here. We have a wooden chair with a sun carved in the back. This was used by George Washington during his time here before he was our first president. That is real. And then, of course, most of this building is original. But now that you know what you're looking at, back to the story. 1774, people want change. They send representatives to the First Continental Congress 2 blocks that way at Carpenters Hall. Like some of you, he was also doing work from home. Okay? He had an apartment a couple blocks that way. It's nice, it's quiet. You put your thoughts together. He writes it out, edits, changes, input. They bring it here. A couple more tweaks, and then they vote to approve for the final time on the morning of July 4th, 1776. A couple days later, they read it out there for the majority of us who could not afford newspapers to learn about things. And about a month later, they start signing a fancy copy in this room. The big one you can see at the Archives building in Washington, D.C., or if you watch the National Treasure movie, that's what we're talking about. They're signing it in here. And finally, after many years of battles and bloodshed, we win our independence. But it's not looking good. We've got internal problems. We've got external problems. We have a loosey-goosey form of government. It's not going to cut it. We can't manage ourselves. So they come back here a final time to write what's going to be the U.S. Constitution. During a long, hot summer, put it together, send it to the 13 states to ratify, to approve it. They want to make sure everybody's all in. And even when all that's done, nobody's totally happy, because in the U.S. Constitution, no one gets exactly what they want. We were a geographically large country even then. We were diverse even then. And everybody had to be willing to give something up, to sacrifice, to compromise, to make it work for the whole. But they've created a system that they think is powerful, they think it's centralized, they think it might last. They had it to New York City for about a year and a half. Where should the capital be? D.C. Not built yet. So they go over there to Congress Hall, our oldest existing U.S. Capitol building. We've got free tours there every 20 minutes, so after you head out here, you can pop over and see what's going on at that end.
This here is the room where it happened. The signing of the Declaration of Independence. The creation of the Constitution. This is a spine-chilling room. Great Essentials Wing. We have copies of the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and the Declaration of Independence. Not only was the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution signed next door at Independence Hall, but the original silver inkstand, made in 1752. That is what made the iron happen.
And just before we continue, here's something most visitors miss. On the side of the West Wing, you'll spot an old clock face. It's actually a replica of the original clock that once stood here before Independence Hall's iconic tower was added during a renovation. A small reminder that even historic landmarks evolve over time.
Right about there would be where Mr. Benjamin Gates found a brick containing some spectacles made by Benjamin Franklin that he used to decipher a treasure map on the back of the Declaration of Independence in Hollywood. The old Philadelphia City Hall, home of the United States Supreme Court from 1791 to 1800, as Washington, D.C. was being constructed.
After seeing the documents that shaped the new nation, it's easy to imagine that the halls of government would be equally grand. But the reality was far simpler. This building, the old City Hall, was shared by the new Supreme Court and by the local government. And while Supreme Court met in the modest chambers here just next door, Congress was hard at work defining what this new government would look like inside Congress Hall.
Congress Hall, from 1790 through 1800. This was the seat of government. The House of Representatives on the lower floor and the Senate up in the upper floor. Here we are in Congress Hall, the original congressional seat.
But what really makes this room in Congress Hall important is not just the laws debated here, it's what happened when power changed hands for the very first time, giving a tradition that has marked the entire American government experiment throughout its history.
DC's partially finished, but this is still the original structure, remains here today, where these ideas that were written down on paper next door actually become a reality in a lot of ways. So the simple fact that George Washington walks into this building as the president, says a few words, and then walks out of here as a private citizen, hands over executive authority, not to somebody he's related to, not to somebody taking it from him with force or violence, but he hands over to somebody who won an election under this Constitution that wasn't even 10 years old yet. And it was an achievement for this young government for sure. It wasn't a public event like it is today. It was just the members of Congress, the Senate, the Supreme Court, packed into this room. So it was crowded in here. Apparently it was a bit emotional as well. John Adams writes a letter describing his inauguration, saying like, and he says there wasn't a dry eye in the place. People were emotional. Everybody was a little sad, except for one person he noticed. One person actually had a look of peace in his eyes and a slight smile on his face. Who do you think that was? George Washington. How do you think that made John Adams feel? How would you feel if you were taking somebody's job from them and they were happy to give it to you? Right? Maybe a little bit nervous. What am I getting myself into? Now, John Adams is not in an enviable position in presidential history. I mean, it's a tough act to follow. Coming after Washington, who basically on paper had unanimous approval. And then you're the first president that half the country basically openly criticizes.
The upper floor of Congress Hall is also the home of joint committee rooms and separate committee rooms, as well as the Senate Secretary's office. Committee rooms go right into the main Senate chamber. Additional balcony up top, adorned and overseen by King Louis XVI on the east side. The west side, Marie Antoinette. This is the U.S. Senate, the upper floor of Congress Hall.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. July 4th, 1776. Those words, however, were penned here. This is the Declaration House, where Thomas Jefferson spent many a day, many an hour working in his thoughts away from the bustle of Independence Hall. It is currently closed to the public. But this is the house wherewith Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence.
Here's the State House bell. You may know it as the Liberty Bell. Originally cast in 1752, 1753. Rung for the last time at 1846. The State House bell, which used to be in Independence Hall. The bell up in Independence Hall now is a Centennial bell, placed up there in 1876. The metal to make bells at that time would notoriously be brittle from time to time, and it was brittle here on the Liberty Bell. There was a hairline fracture, and to try to fix it, they put some drill bits in wide rings, actually a common practice at the time. And then they decided to try to give it one last ring, 1846 for Washington's birthday, and with that it cracked again, a new hairline fracture that runs from the top of the wide crack up near the top, and it's not rung ever since. The Liberty Bell, 2,080 pounds. The current bell, the Centennial Bell in Independence Hall, upward of 13,000 pounds. So this was the original crack here, and then they widened it to try to actually fix it, which is what was common practice at the time. But then they rang it one last time, and it created that extra small crack that goes all the way to the top.
So if they ring it again,
ever since.
little thing,
That tiny little crack that goes through the word "and."
yeah, it goes all the way up. And that's how big it got.
Yeah, that's the crack that happened the last time it rang.
Throughout its history, the Liberty Bell has witnessed the creation of a nation and the end of slavery.
Here's a visitor tip for you. While Independence Hall requires a timed tour entry, the Liberty Bell does not. I would highly recommend making the Liberty Bell your first stop as soon as it opens for the day if you can. With virtually no line first thing in the morning, you have plenty of time to yourselves with the Liberty Bell and the exhibits. This line that you see here was during the afternoon. If you can, avoid this trouble and make the Liberty Bell your first stop. The Liberty Bell reminds us of the words and ideals that shaped the new nation, but just steps away, the foundations of those ideals were tested. Before there was a White House, this was where America's first two presidents lived and governed. But it's also where the contradictions of freedom and slavery stood side by side. Let's take a look.
Just outside the Liberty Bell, as part of Independence National Historic Park, you come across the President's House site. The President's House site discusses the executive branch as a whole, the President's office and the actions of the executive, especially in the early days of the nation.
But it also talks about the difficulties here as George Washington and John Adams lived on this site, in the house that was here on this site as they were building the White House in Washington, D.C. And then the enslaved workers that also were here. Now, George Washington, upon his death, he freed all of his enslaved workers. John Adams, I don't believe, had any enslaved workers. I could be wrong. And history always reminds us when we think we know things, we don't always. But here are the remains of the President's House Foundation. This site does seek to provide voice to those who are often forgotten as those who work for the president or those who work for any other politicians or the elite, and the juxtaposition with that and freedom.
It was called Diaries of My Travels in America. This is how it reads. The general's cook ran away and left her little daughter of 6 at Mount Vernon. My secretary said that the little girl must be.
But then the 6 months started all over.
From modern buildings, back in time, to Carpenters Hall. This building was actually erected in 1774 for a group of craftsmen, the Carpenters Company. And it was here that they held the first Continental Congress in 1774. They, led by Patrick Henry, led by the Adamses, John and Sam Adams of Boston, and others. They didn't seek revolution here at the First Continental Congress, but they sought to end trade with Britain, to denounce the British invasion. And they still sought to reconcile, but they also, upon adjourning, agreed to meet again the following May in 1775 if the grievances had not been settled. By the time that had occurred in the Second Continental Congress in 1775, bloodshed had already occurred in Boston, in Lexington, Concord. Carpenters Hall. While the First National Bank was being built, Alexander Hamilton also used Carpenters Hall to be the first bank. And the Carpenters Hall was also used to be the second bank when the second bank was being built. Huh. Interesting. The Christ Church burial ground established in 1719. Right across, actually. Maybe hard to see, but the burial grounds of this church, which is Christ Church, the remains of 7 signers of the Declaration of Independence: Benjamin Rush, James Wilson, George Ross, Joseph Hughes, Francis Hopkinson, Robert Morris, and Benjamin Franklin. Robert Morris. Here in the graveyard of Christ Church, Revolutionary flags, 13 colonies for the signers of the Declaration of Independence are buried here. Major General Charles Lee, General of the Continental Army. The Free Quaker Meeting House, established here in 1783. The structure was built here in 1783. The Quakers traditionally are a pacifist, non-fighting denomination, but the Free Quakers themselves took an active role in supporting the American Revolution, contrary to their more traditional counterparts. The building was erected in 1783 by the local Free Quakers of Philadelphia. One of the most memorable names passed down through Revolutionary folklore belonged to one of these Free Quakers who chose to support the cause. Betsy Ross remains woven into the fabric of our founding, and we can even step inside her home to learn more. Neighborhood of Philadelphia. And another older house here in Philadelphia, adorned by a particular flag. It's here that an accomplished upholsterer was not a seamstress. She did not make dresses. She was an upholsterer. So she would work on upholstery, chairs, things of the like. Betsy Ross is credited with creating the first American flag. And she was approached by her uncle and George Washington and Robert Morris. And she made a few changes to the flag just to make it a little easier to construct. Betsy says that George Washington's first idea for a star was a star similar to his design, which is a six-pointed, very thin star, which would be very difficult to actually cut and make and sew, so she helped decide on 5 stars and a more rectangular, typical flag pattern as opposed to a square flag, which is quite unusual. But other than that, she helped design. The story of this house continues the story of her life and what life would have been like for her during this time. That was a neat little stop inside the Betsy Ross house. You even have an actor portrayed as Betsy to answer any questions that you might have. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Here we are at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, obviously Independence Hall, the signing of the Declaration of Independence during the American Revolution. It's easy to forget that when talk of independence began, many American colonists still saw the king as a protector of their rights, and the question of breaking away wasn't so clear-cut. These debates separated families and neighbors, as well as the most powerful native tribe alliance, the Iroquois Confederacy.
War is death. Fighting in battle is hard, and the outcome of war is our decision.
The help of others declares that these united colonies are free and independent states, absolved of all allegiance.
The War of the American Revolution here in Philadelphia encompasses the entirety of the revolution itself. The decision to declare war, to issue a Declaration of Independence, how that affected the Loyalists, the Revolutionaries, the British, the French, the natives, the native tribes all across the American interior, as well as women, enslaved peoples. It is a very interesting and really well put together and well flowing museum, chronologically from place to place. It doesn't focus solely on Philadelphia. If that is what you're looking for, this museum is not it. It discusses things in New York, Boston, Virginia, and Pennsylvania and the South, in the Carolinas. And such, but a very well put together museum. I would highly recommend a trip to the Museum of the American Revolution. If you've ever seen the Mel Gibson movie, The Patriot, from the late 90s, I want to say, there's a section here about the war in the South, and particularly in the Carolinas, after the failure to split the colony Saratoga in the British attempt then to travel through the South and win through the South. But there's displays here about Tarleton and the British Dragoons, who were notoriously considered to be violent and vicious in their attacks, as well as the backcountry, such as the cowpens, the road to the cowpens, and the names given to some of the fighters, the American Revolutionaries, their nicknames based on their own tactics. Here we have photographs for individuals that were involved in the American Revolutionary War. Obviously, these are older individuals. And photographs were finally available in the mid-1800s, particularly looking for their pension payments and things along those lines, but all types of revolutionaries, Native Americans, African Americans, men, women, the faces of the American Revolution.
But the story of America's founding didn't end in 1776. Just steps away, the National Constitution Center brings the next chapter to life, exploring how the ideals of the Revolution became the foundation of a nation. Once you step inside the National Constitution Center, you're welcomed by a grand hall flanked by the flags of every state and territory. But once you step in a little bit further, just like the Constitution itself, the deeper meaning begins to unfold, because tucked behind the quiet entry is a living, breathing collection of stories, from the fiery debates of 1787 to the ever-changing amendments that followed. It's a journey that mirrors the document that it celebrates, unassuming on the surface, but layered with voices, conflicts, and ideals that shaped and continue to shape a nation.
This is Signers Hall at the National Constitution Center. Life-size bronze sculptures of each of the signers of the U.S. Constitution. Nameplates down below of who they are, where they're from, their occupation, and their age upon signing. Some of these you would recognize. Others are not so famous and popular. But all of them agree in the framing of our government. Just outside Signers Hall, they have a display of various bills of rights, draftings of the Bill of Rights, of the Declaration of Independence from before the Bill of Rights, and some of the documents that inspired the Declaration of Independence, how the copies were made with official copies here on site. Looks like here we have Senate revisions to the proposed amendments from 1789. As the Constitution is the means and the law of the land of government and how the government is going to be structured, there is display here regards to how that comes to be. After independence, the individual states each set up their own republics. Everybody enjoyed the British system of mixed government, but not a single state copied the British system. No lords, no kings. Virginia declared its rights first in 1776. And with each state writing its own constitution, they were independent republics amongst themselves. And it wasn't until 1787 that it was deemed necessary to create a union of the states together. The Articles of Confederation being similar to a treaty amongst independent nations. It was not sufficient enough to help the states who were wrangling amongst themselves to live peaceably together. (1787) during the Constitutional Convention. Types of governments around the world. United States, a constitutional democracy. Some republican governments in Central Europe. And some of that was modeled about and discussed in the Federalist Papers written by James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton. And some of those sections of the Republican government were included within the Constitution. But they wanted to make sure that representatives would indeed be speaking and held accountable by the people. Various sections and articles of the United States Constitution, noting the changes by various amendments as needed.
From the bronze statues of the founders in Signers Hall, we move swiftly but gradually from the past and into the present, where the Constitution stops being just a document and starts becoming a dialogue. Here you're invited to cast your vote, test your understanding of checks and balances, and wrestle with the compromises that shaped a fledgling republic. It's no longer just history on display, it's a mirror held up to the nation that we live in now.
Large-scale models of the various houses of government. Here's the Capitol building. With a neat animation about the balance of powers, and how bills become laws, how laws can be vetoed, vetoes overridden, challenged in court by the Supreme Court. As well as examples of when one branch challenges the authority of the other branch, or rules that one branch has done something against the Constitution. This is really cool. You can even vote for president here, and it shows current standings as they pit particular presidents amongst themselves. Randomly selects presidents, and then you select the quote that you would agree with most. It does not necessarily mean that you don't agree with one or the other, but one that you may agree with most. Of what you would agree with more, it gives you your fantasy election. The 5 freedoms of the First Amendment: religion, speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and freedom of petition. They also go hand in hand with the separation of church and state to allow for the government to make sure that the people are not infringed by the government of their right to express freely their thoughts and their ideas, and the free exchange of ideas. This free exchange of ideas allows people to argue, allows people to have different viewpoints, and it allows people to live by their faith. But the separation of church and state was not in the Constitution. It actually came from the 1600s. Roger Williams of Rhode Island, a Baptist minister, firmly believed in the freedom of the soul. Even if you disagree with someone else, they have the right, freedom of conscience in the soul. The Constitution is such an interesting document. It's such an interesting concept because we always want to go back to learn what was the original intent of the writers, of the authors, of the framers, to understand what they meant when they were writing this, that, or the other. But at the same time, the Constitution is a living document as society changes, as amendments are added to reflect the changes in society. The Supreme Court decides individual cases, lawsuits against the government or against other entities, and that's how some of the major ramifications are decided upon, or they have far-reaching extensions. And then when the government or the president wants to take action in the event of some tragedy, in the event of some war, economic situation, social strife, if the actions of the government, do they infringe upon the rights of others? And then which rights can trump other rights when there is a conflict of rights amongst themselves? All of these are interesting questions. Questions that are not so simple, and often we, the people, just simply disagree. And that's okay.
Some of the Constitution's most powerful changes came not from the founders, but from the fires of reckoning that followed. The Reconstruction Amendments, born from the ashes of the Civil War, promised a new vision of freedom and equality, but that promise was quickly tested and too often betrayed. And decades later, after generations of activism and resistance, the Constitution grew again, as women finally secured the right to vote, expanding the idea of we the people to include more of the people. These galleries don't just tell stories of progress, they remind us that every amendment is the result of a struggle, and that the Constitution is not just a finished document, but a living one. Here at the National Constitution Center, we see both the ideals and the imperfections, and the work that still lies ahead. From the crack in the Liberty Bell to the room where independence was declared, Philadelphia isn't just a city, it's where America was born. But just how the Constitution was only a starting point, this is just the beginning for the city of brotherly love. We've got a lot more Philadelphia stories coming your way, from Benjamin Franklin's footsteps to cheesesteaks, pop culture, and hidden gems you won't want to miss. So hit that subscribe button and follow along, because every journey tells a story, and we'll see you in the next one.